new, we always have to have a saviour, but what we don't like to do is to challenge our underlying assumptions. Okay, I think we're almost there. So now we just need to scroll down. Slideshow.
Do you remember number what?
I don't remember the number, but I'll remember when you get to it. Stop. Sorry, go up again.
Yeah.
Up again. We'll stop there and I can backtrack. Good. So we're back on track and we're oh, I can see myself. That's very, very disconcerting.
You have a new name.
I have a new name. I'm Icelandic. I can stay. Okay. Right. So we've got until about 12:15, I think. I'm afraid this is more of me talking. You're doing very well so far. And as I said, promise this won't go on exactly like this after lunch. When this is why you came in the first place, to talk about the power threat meaning framework. So this is the kind of what I've been saying up till now. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, we ask to know what's happened to you. Have you come across that slogan? It's quite a well-known slogan in the UK. Instead of diagnosing people or telling them they are mentally ill or alcoholics or have addictive personalities, we need to find a midpoint between brain and blame and listen to their stories. And those need to be non-diagnostic stories. So the power threat meaning framework, which I'm about to explain to you in possibly more detail than you want, is all about that. So what is the power threat meaning framework? The power threat meaning framework is a project that took 5 years to produce. It was funded and published by the British Psychological Society. And I and Mary Boyle are the lead authors. The other main authors are listed next to us. We're all psychologists and or service users. So Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon are both survivors of the psychiatric system, as they would see it, were thought to have mental illnesses from which they would never recover. And as the project continued, we had a group of about 40 other people who advised us and read the manuscripts and gave us feedback and provide their expert opinion. So a very, very ambitious project. And the reason the project got off the ground in the first place is because in 2013, my professional body, which is the Division of Clinical Psychology, issued this position statement. So this is a formal position statement on behalf of all psychologists in the UK, although not all psychologists agree with it. So for clinical psychologists, you don't need to read all of that paragraph. Our professional body says that the diagnostic system has significant limitations. We need a paradigm shift towards a system not based on a disease model. So it's actually saying we need to abandon the disease model, the diagnostic model, altogether. Now, as I said, that was controversial. Certainly not everyone agrees with it. But nevertheless, it's a very significant statement. And I don't think there's any other countries, any other organizations in any countries that I'm aware of who've come up with a similar statement. So I think it was a brave thing to do. And because of that, when a group of us approached our professional body and said, we'd like to have a go at doing this, they were willing to fund this project. So the group of us that I just showed you, the main group, the top group, we are psychologists, clinicians, academics, survivors, and we've all known each other for many years. I've known Mary for about 30 years, and from our collective research, academic, clinical, and lived experience perspectives, none of us have ever believed in the diagnostic model. So we had a common shared starting point. We knew each other, we trusted each other, and I don't think any other group of people could probably have done exactly what we've done, which is not to say that it's perfect, because it isn't. So we set out thinking, okay, we've been saying for a long time that diagnosis isn't the way to go. There are a lot of good projects which aren't based on diagnosis, but we need a bigger framework that can actually look like it's a credible alternative to the diagnostic model altogether. It's a meta framework. It's bigger than any particular approach, or any particular model. It's trying to come up with a completely different set of basic principles. So we're saying that the principles that we can understand what goes wrong in our lives in the same way that we can understand what goes wrong in our bodies is fundamentally mistaken. We need a different paradigm. We are not claiming to have produced that paradigm, but if we have taken people somewhere along the line, along the road, that would be great. So it's on the website. There are the documents are all free, and I've got the link to the website somewhere. And there are two documents. There's a shorter version, which is the framework itself. There's a much bigger document, which is 200,000 words long, which consists of all the massive amount of research and thinking and reading and reflection we did to support the framework itself. So it's a massive overview of all the social, psychological and biological causal factors, all the evidence, including some of the evidence we've discussed today. And while I don't think many people have read that, it's very long and dense and you don't have to read it, I think that has to exist because we wanted to make sure that the framework was very solidly embedded in research and in evidence. Although at the same time, we are saying we also need to think carefully about what counts as evidence, because too often what people actually say about their lives is discounted. That's anecdotes. So we also want to include evidence in the forms of what people say about their lives. Chapter 8 has got some thoughts about some of the things that have already been raised today. What do we do about diagnosis, access to welfare? What do we do about diagnosis in the legal system? These are not formal recommendations. They're just some thoughts about how we could do it differently in a non-diagnostic way. And this was launched in London in 2018, January, and there's supposed to be a video playing, and it hasn't appeared. So I'm going to skip that. We may look at that result rather than fiddle around further with that. That there is a short video which should have come up, which is the framework authors at the launch. I'll save that for later. Okay, and that's the book. I think I've sold a few copies already. So although the main documents are free to download, this is not free. It's fairly inexpensive. You've got a leaflet on your tables. You can order this from PCCS Books in the UK and they will send it abroad. It's about 2,600 kroner. So this is the nearest thing to how to put this into practice if you're working with someone one-to-one, or perhaps with a friend or a peer worker, or if you want to think about yourself on your own life. So it could be used in a kind of self-help way, because the framework is about all of us, not just people who are said to have mental health problems. So it takes you through the framework in a way that I hope is simple and accessible, complex ideas expressed in a way that I hope makes sense. Okay. So it's an attempt to outline an alternative to the diagnostic model of distress and unusual experiences, funded by my professional body, but not an official approach that all psychologists have to use. It's a set of ideas. That was partly why I said at the beginning, you know, there's lots about your particular settings that I don't know. And the framework is not about coming along and saying, do it this way, run your services in this way, set up your service in this way, do this with your client. It's about saying, here's some very broad level ideas. We would be really interested to hear how you might make use of those if you want to. It's optional. We'd also be very interested in you getting back to us, maybe doing some evaluations. Then we can add it to the website. And so as the project evolves, and this is nearly 6 years down the line, we can all, if we want to, be part of taking it further, if you like. So that is what we are collecting evidence for it, if you like, and we are collecting examples of good practice. On the website, there are a number of examples of good practice, people using the framework in a range of settings. And it's been very controversial. May talk about that at the end if I don't know. I'll see how I feel. People have said some very rude things about me and about the framework. But actually, when I've explained it a bit to you, I think you'll see why it might be threatening to some people. Okay, so we replaced diagnostic understandings with narrative-based ones. So we've already looked at one form of narrative, formulation. So in the UK, we're used to thinking that this particular narrative can be a replacement for diagnosis. not everywhere, but certainly it can be used in that way. So we've built on formulation work, we've built on trauma-informed practice, but we actually try to go quite a lot further than that. Because if you think about narratives, that includes all sorts of things. It can, that people find healing. It can include art, music, dance, theatre. It can include poetry. It can include, in some communities, particularly ones in non-Western countries and cultures, where you come together as a group, where you tell stories together. I expect that's what the Vikings did back in AD 910 or whatever. As I was hearing about in your interesting museum, the Saga Museum, there would have been a lot of collective storytelling, and some of that can be understood, I think, as a way of understanding and healing and collectively sharing distress. So narrative includes all those forms of making sense, most of which are non-professional, because historically we haven't had a mental health profession, have we? We haven't had a mental health system. We didn't know we needed one. Possibly we didn't. Anyway, we can come back to that. And it's about restoring the link between distress and social injustice. So we've already talked, that theme has already come up, individualizing the problems of people, particularly women, let's say, who've been raped or abused, by telling them that they have a personality disorder. It's about putting the link back between those experiences and the kind of society in which those things happen. Empowering people and promoting social action. We actually can't solve the so-called mental health epidemic that seems to be sweeping over Western societies without, in the end, taking social action, because those are the roots of the problems. Okay, so that's the website, and you're welcome to visit it. It's all free. We wanted it to be free knowledge. This is not about us making money out of it or expensive training courses. This is free knowledge for anyone to use if they want to. Right, so we've talked a lot about trauma-informed practice already. The framework does draw on this, but we like to take a critical approach to everything. So not everything about trauma-informed practice meets with our approval. So some trauma-informed practice is still quite strongly based on diagnosis. You've got dissociative disorder, for example. You have PTSD. The D is the disorder of it, is not something we're entirely happy with. And some trauma-informed practice is very much solely focused on the individual. So we want to keep in mind the bigger context of trauma, the roots of the tree of that diagram, as well as the leaves. And we also want to think about patterns of distress that are related to not too obvious trauma. So many people will say, well, I had a happy, comfortable life, I have loving family, I have a good job, etc., etc. Even in some of the wealthier countries in the UK, there are,
Keep on going.
Yes, even in countries with actually good welfare systems where most people are doing okay, like I was visiting Denmark recently, there are a number of people who are still, there are rising tides of distress, even in the absence of obvious traumas. So we do want to understand that as well. So something interesting is happening here.
I'm seeing if
yes, I suddenly lost that, didn't I? Okay, that back.
Oh no, I think.
Okay. Fingers crossed. So we're all storytellers and meaning makers. This is not just about professionals, though it is partly about professionals. We support the use of all kinds of narratives or personal stories. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. From chemical imbalance to power imbalance, the framework is about all of us. Okay. So if we want to put together a narrative as opposed to a diagnostic understanding, how might we do that? The framework suggests this very loose structure. Okay, this is not a new form of assessment procedure where you have to sit down with your pen and go through these questions and tick off the answers. This is a loose structure for putting together or jointly constructing a narrative. That can be a narrative at a one-to-one level. It could be your own personal narrative that you sit and think about yourself. It could be a narrative for a family, for a social group, for a community, for a team, for a system, for an organization. We all have narratives. and we all exist in part of a network of narratives. So we have taken the slogan, instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me, and we've expanded that. So what's happened to you in PTMF terms is how is power operating in your life? How did it affect you? What kind of threats does this pose? What sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences to you? What did you have to do to survive? What kind of threats are you using? And you might want to add or start with what are your strengths, and to pull everything else together, what is your story? So you do not have to use these questions or these prompts in those words or in that order. They are areas to think about. They are overlapping. We're going to do an exercise using these this afternoon, and you will see that one in question implies the other. As soon as you start talking about power, you are inevitably talking about threat. As soon as you start talking about threat, you are inevitably talking about meaning. So a loose structure, don't take it too literally or too rigidly. But it's really, really important to us that we started with power. You don't need to read all those words, because it seemed to us that power is the aspect that is missing by definition from diagnostic understandings. Diagnostic understandings are about what goes on inside your brain, essentially, or body in your brain, but also missing from a lot of psychology and psychotherapy. Interestingly, a lot of psychology and psychotherapy is very focused on the individual. So it's not just diagnostic understandings that we oppose any understandings that are too narrowly focused at the individual. So you're in a way ending up saying it's your fault. You've got to change your brain chemistry or your chemical imbalance, or you've got to change your negative way of thinking. It's two sides of the same coin. So we thought about all these forms of power because a lot of these we're not used to thinking about. We're used to thinking about interpersonal power, I'm sure, if we are therapists, about people's relationships and the way they can be damaging and so on. That's the trauma-informed stuff. We're less used to thinking about economic and material power, how that impacts on people. We are less used to thinking about social and cultural capital, by which I mean the subtle advantages that you have. If use myself as an example, I'm someone who is lucky enough to benefit from a lot of social and cultural capital because I'm white, I'm educated, I'm middle class, etc., etc. That's given me a lot of advantages that not everyone has. I've also had some difficulties in my life, of course, like everybody does. But I think we often neglect to take into account what it's like to live with very little social capital, to not have, you know, the accent in the UK or the resources or the confidence or the education or the qualifications that enable you to live a good life. And if we give people a label, we are making it even harder for them to access social capital. And we've also talked a lot about ideological power, which I'll explain in a minute. So why is power so central in the framework? Power is everywhere in our lives, even if we're not aware of it. All the major causes of mental health problems and addictions involve inequalities of power. There's a list there. Poverty and low social status, differences in wealth and incomes, child abuse and neglect, gender-based, race-based discrimination, colonization, war and conflict. Now, there's a mountain of research to show that. We often act as though we don't know what causes mental health problems. In the UK, there's a new £1 million project to work out, well, what really causes depression or what really causes psychosis. This, I think, is nonsense. We know far too much about what causes mental health problems. The difficulty is tackling the causes. So these are facts. These are facts. These experiences lead to distress. Surprise, surprise. And rather than actually take on the implications of that, we put millions of money into developing, millions of pounds or krona in Iceland, into developing new drugs and so on. These problems all arise from power differences. We don't set up our training programs, we don't set up our services as though we understand this, even though it's true. Ideological power is very, very important. And this is more difficult to explain in a way, but ideological power refers to the kind of things we take as normal and obvious and desirable, the worldviews we have, the assumptions we make about ourselves and others, how we should live our lives, what we mean by success or failure, what kind of people we want to be, and so on. And these messages come from all around us, from our education, from our media, and so on. And they're often shaped by stereotypes. We have stereotypes about particular groups of people in society, women versus men, refugees, particular ethnic groups, and so on. So ideological power is all around us. It's often very hard to question because we don't realize that we are being influenced by it. We think that's just the way the world is, or just the way the world should be. So we have many examples in the UK. Going to mention a very painful subject, Brexit. What a disaster that was. I didn't vote for it, nor did anyone know, interestingly. So I obviously live in a bit of a bubble. But Brexit was ideologically motivated. It was sold to us by people, wealthy people, who have since become much wealthier at the expense of vast numbers of poorer people who've become much poorer. So we have food banks and homeless people on every street. It's been a disaster. And it was sold to us as ideological power often is through the use of language. So we were told we're reclaiming our independence and our sovereignty, and we want to keep those nasty immigrants from coming and taking over our NHS and so on. I mean, all lies, but sometimes this does have the desired effect. So an ideologically driven project. So language is often used to shape power in the interests of people who are already more powerful and to the disadvantage of people who are less powerful. So these are slightly obvious examples, but if a woman's raped and we say she asked for it, that's a very powerful way of discounting and silencing her. If we call people living in poverty their welfare scroungers, that's a very powerful way of blaming them for being lazy, and so on. But similarly, provocative statement coming up, we think it's a misuse of power, of ideological power, to use language like they are psychotic, personality disordered, mentally ill, an addict. This is a way of turning social problems into individual ones and blaming the individual, who then ends up feeling stigmatized, as we discussed earlier. Their fault, and they have become the source of the problem. So you don't have to agree with that, but I think it's worth thinking about. Mental health services have to be there for a reason, don't they? There's plenty of research to show that actually they don't actually produce good outcomes. They, on the whole, tend to make people worse, not better. They're better at creating patients than curing them. So we have to think about, well, whose interests are they serving? Well, for many decades, a critique of psychiatry has been that it serves social purposes. We can push social problems under the carpet. We can ignore them. We can blame the individual. We can also then, a lot of people can make money out of them, whether they're highly paid, high-profile professionals or drug companies or whatever. Okay. Power and ideological power frequently shaped by sex role stereotypes. So in the UK, women are often overrepresented in mental health services, more likely to be trapped in violent relationships, to have low-paid jobs, and to carry the main responsibility for childcare. So here's a quote from someone saying, "One of the reasons I felt so down was because I had to admit myself I was not a perfect mother." Well, that's a very sad thing, isn't it? So what she's saying is that she's picked up a lot of standards about how mothers should be, applied them to herself, concluded that it's her problem she wasn't living up to them. Well, actually, we have ridiculous standards about what being a mother is, and as any mother in the room will know, and I'm a mother, but we also, in the UK, certainly have very little childcare support, a lot of people living in poverty. We do not live in a society where it's easy to be a parent. We can shape that by, if you're a woman, you have to be an all-loving, perfect mother. Nobody's like that. And same for men. Men are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, in the UK at least, in drug and alcohol services, and among the homeless, are high risk of suicide, less likely to ask for help. So here's a man who feels desperate after losing his job. I'm the man in the relationship. I'm meant to the man to take care of the missus, my wife, in other words, and my kids. And I don't, and I hate feeling like I do with myself because of it. So here's a man who's lost his job, almost certainly for economic reasons and through no fault of his own, but because he's taken on this worldview that I'm a man, it's my job to support my family, he sees it entirely as his personal failure. So these are obvious things in a way, but these are difficult to spot, difficult to challenge, and I think we often leave these things go unchallenged. Okay, when we focus on power, it's much harder to change what's happened back to what's wrong with you. I'm going to go through the rest of this fairly briefly because we're going to be trying it out in the afternoon, as I said. So that's the first question. We've also thought in the framework about our core needs and what happens when those core needs are threatened. So this is a list, you don't need to read all that, but this is a list of what we would all ideally like and need in our lives just because we're human beings. We want to be safe and valued in our relationships. We want to feel secure in our family and social group, have a safe physical environment, to form close relationships, to be able to manage our feelings, to feel effective in our roles, and so on, down to have connections to the natural world and have a sense of hope, meaning and purpose in our lives. Now, none of us will feel okay about all those things all the time, but we need to have enough of those to make life feel worthwhile. And the misuse of power will pose a threat to any or all of those. So power, if it's used negatively, and of course it can be used positively, where we are all in the jobs we're in because we want to gain some power through our training, through our experience, and use it positively. But so power is neutral, but in the framework we talk more about the threats that are posed by power. So power may threaten us, may threaten our core needs in various areas, in our relationships, in our ability to manage our emotions, in our links to the community, in our economic and material security. In our links to the environment, look what we're doing to the environment, terrible and very frightening, to our bodily integrity, again, to our ability to create meanings about our lives. We're back to ideological power again. Are we encouraged to come up with our own values, our own meanings? Okay, I'm going to skip that one actually. What sense did you make of it? This is the third question. We actively make sense of our world, but what do we mean by meaning? Any therapist will be to some extent looking at people's meanings and working with people's meanings, but in the framework we wanted to go beyond just purely personal meanings. We wanted to think about where meanings come from. So individual meanings are never just freely chosen. Meaning is both made and found. If I develop a personal meaning about myself or my beliefs, or a bit like the examples we just saw, if a mother develops a belief that she's a bad mother, or a husband develops a belief that he's a bad husband, that didn't just pop up in his own head, it came from somewhere. So our personal meanings are shaped by all the understandings we hear around us. What do we as a society generally understand by saying someone's mentally ill or successful or a good mother or an addict or a refugee? And those meanings themselves also have ideological roots and purposes. So one of the examples I often give here is that in my last clinical job, I and colleagues set up a series of groups for women who are survivors of rape and sexual abuse. And I've probably worked with many hundreds of women who've had those experiences during my career. And each and every one of them has come to me and said how ashamed, how bad, how guilty, how it was their fault, how terrible they feel about it. But almost everyone had never told anyone. I was very often the first person they told. So the obvious thing to ask is, how come several hundred women have all come with this secret meaning and it's all the same meaning? How did that happen? Well, the obvious example is that they must have picked this up from messages all around them. So if you have people in a group, it's a very powerful way of undoing those messages. So if one woman can see another woman, the other side of the room, saying, it was my fault, then she can clearly see, well, you were only 6, you were only 10, you were only 16, how could it be your fault? So then perhaps you can start thinking, perhaps it wasn't my fault. So that in this group, we very deliberately took it further than that to think about how come every one of us in this group has ended up thinking it's our fault. So then we can think about the messages from wider society about women and what they should wear and where they should go and how they should behave, and men and all the rest of it, and how it works very much in the interests of powerful individuals, including abusers, for the women to blame themselves. And then as a society, we don't have to think nearly as much as we should about the widespread prevalence of violence and abuse in women's and girls' lives. Yes, so we're going beyond what you would usually call therapy, if you like. I mean, we used to call this consciousness raising in the 70s. I do remember the 70s, but probably not all of you do. So it's not new stuff. An awful lot of, most of the stuff in the framework isn't new, but we need to revisit some of this stuff. Because if you go that step further to think about power, then one of the things that may happen, and did to some of the women in our group, they decided they were going to join us as equals to train the other members of staff in supporting women who've been abused, and they set up their own self-help group and so on. So it's taking it a step further, so some people will want to take up social action. What did you have to do to survive? So this is what in psychiatry or psychology we sometimes call symptoms, as we've already discussed. Trauma-informed practice has a lot to say about this, so I won't go through that again. So here are some examples of threat responses in PTMF language, symptoms in psychiatric language. And down at the bottom, I've put some of the things that don't get described as symptoms, but as Gabor Mate says, can perhaps be understood as sort of addiction, sort of ways of dealing with threat, overwork and perfectionism. Those are my two. If life gets too difficult for me, I'm quite likely to spend 6 hours in front of the computer and block everything out. It's not healthy behavior, but it's socially valued behavior. I get rewards for it. No one's going to put me in hospital and inject me because of that. So this is not exactly the same as a list of symptoms, because it depends on how valued these ways of coping are. I'm going to stop. I will stop for some questions. I won't go straight through till 12:15. So this is the way we think about threat responses in the framework. We think it doesn't make any sense to say what causes depression, what causes addiction, what causes psychosis. Because if you unpick those things, if, for example, you unpick what causes depression and ask what causes people to feel desperate, hopeless, stuck, trapped, guilty and suicidal, well, the only possible answer is lots of things, isn't it? So it actually doesn't make sense to expect simple answers to that kind of question. The way we look at it in the framework is that everything that can be seen as a threat response can be seen in terms of its function. What is it doing for you? Why do you need this in your life? Why do you need to think, not consciously, but necessarily, but why do you at the moment need to think, feel, or behave in this way? And the answer is we all have very core needs, which we will do almost anything to meet. So we all need to manage or escape our overwhelming feelings. We might do that in lots of ways. It's not just people using drugs who are doing that. We may escape our feelings by dissociation, by self-harming, by hearing voices, by compulsive activity. We all need to preserve a place for ourselves in a social group. We all need to feel we're part of a group. We can do this by being competitive, by trying to please everyone, by blaming ourselves. Using drugs or alcohol may help us to be part of a group of people, which is better than being not part of any group. So this brings us to perhaps one of the most important bits of the framework, which is making the link between threats and threat responses. So when we give someone a diagnosis or an identity, such as an alcoholic or a mentally ill person, we obscure the links between threats and threat responses. and instead we say we're treating an illness or disorder. And the framework shows how we can put back those links. So making a link between threats and threat responses is the same thing as saying making a link between personal distress and social injustice and inequality, which is one of those things that's kind of obvious. If you asked any person in the street, do you think people living in poverty are more likely to feel desperate and to use drugs? They'd probably say, well, yeah, I guess they are. But as soon as we know that, we start to think about new treatments for depression. There's an epidemic of depression, and we lose the link again. So, and the diagnosis is a particularly powerful way of losing that link. We get distracted, or as we were discussing earlier, we talk about a mental health problem. Mental health problems are spreading, but we stop talking about people's actual feelings and their actual circumstances. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of disconnecting threat responses from threats, because it's everywhere. So in the UK, we've had a lot of these articles about COVID. We have been told that we are facing a tsunami, a tidal wave of mental health problems after COVID, after lockdown. So this seems like very unfortunate, doesn't it? We had an epidemic of a deadly virus, and now we've got an epidemic of mental health problems. Two epidemics, one after another. So, but maybe this isn't a coincidence. So if you look at the research, you can clearly see that the people who are most struggling with what we are told to call our mental health, struggling with our feelings and our emotions and our lives, are those who have been having the most difficult time. They are exhausted professionals. They are older people who are isolated. They are people who haven't got enough money because they've lost their jobs. Almost all minority ethnic groups had higher risks of dying from COVID than the white British majority of a comparable age. So people with more to struggle with were struggling more. Yeah, and what COVID did was expose the massive inequalities in UK life. And by hastily disconnecting the threat from the threat responses, by jumping up and saying we need lots more doctors, lots more nurses, lots more clinics, we have prevented ourselves as a society from looking at that. That makes sense. So I wrote this article saying, in ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed, and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed, and anxious. But it is not a pandemic of mental health problems we need to fear, but a pandemic of mental health thinking. Does that make sense? If we think in that way, we will not learn the messages from COVID, and I'm sure we're not going to in the UK until we get rid of our dreadful, 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 toxic government, which may come early next year, and I hope to God it does. Okay. We're having a hard time in the UK. Okay, here's another example. Rates of mental disorders among 17 to 19-year-olds increased in 2022. 1 in 4 of these young people had a probable mental health disorder. Well, that sounds bad, but if you look at how those young people were describing themselves, it begins to make more sense. They were the ones who said they'd been bullied, were unsafe in school, hadn't got friends, and were worried about exams. They were the ones who lived in families who couldn't afford to pay the mortgage or heat the house or buy enough food. Is it surprising they were feeling more upset and distressed? These are also the young people who are going to be offered all sorts of mental health interventions that are being rolled out across schools in the UK, which are about kind of breathing calmly and mindfulness, which is fine, but that's not addressing their real problems. It's telling them they need to take responsibility for their mental disorder. Okay, here's another example. Can you read that from the back? I shall leave you to read. This is an example. I put this one in because it's about a young woman who actually hasn't experienced obvious traumas in the way that many people have. Another example from the UK. This is from one of our most right-wing newspapers, by the way. This is a very, very sad story, isn't it? Here's a young woman with everything to live for and no obvious traumas. She's been lucky, but it's made very little distance. She's tried to kill herself twice. She's desperately unhappy. Can you see the ideological pressures that are driving her to feel like that? Yeah, she's got to look like this. She's got to live, have I don't know what it is, be this size and shape and have these friends and do these activities and achieve these grades. These are not traumas as we usually understand them, but they are tremendous ideological pressures in line with values that are very toxic, I think. Achievement, materialism, consumerism, competition at the expense of cooperation and community and all the rest of it. We live in a very fragmented society in the UK. Can you also see how the two solutions she was offered are very individual? She's been offered the pills, they didn't help. She's been offered the therapy. I guess that was probably a very individualized, you know, think a bit better about yourself, write a list of your good qualities. I guess it was that kind of therapy. What I think she stands for many, many, many young girls and boys in the UK at the moment. Many, many, many. That's what's so sad. In a way, they need a version of the group I described with the women who are survivors of rape and sexual abuse. They need the opportunity to sit down together, to find they all share the same worries, to unpick some of the messages, to decide together whether they're going to resist some of those messages, because clearly what she's been offered hasn't helped. Okay, I'm going to stop there for 10-minute questions, 10 minutes of questions or comments. And then yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm interested in your thoughts about the balance between the individual's responsibility and then professional responsibility in maybe coercion in the context.
Coercion, what do you mean by?
Then to maybe the struggle about responsibility professionals might have about how then to interact and then not if the individual might not want it, or that you respect the person's right to
Okay.
and then would you have to intervene?
Okay, so is it can I just check, is it too hot or too cold in here, or okay? Too cold. Could we do some? Has it? They have fixed it. Good. Okay. Okay. It's going to be warmer, folks. Good. Cold will keep you awake. Yeah. Well, I guess from the framework point of view, we take the position, I guess, that we should never be forcing treatment on people. And actually, it doesn't work, does it? People need to make their own decisions. And I'm not quite sure if this is what you're asking.
I'm supported by them and others can judge the professional for neglect.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Sorry, repeat the question, because I'm still not sure. So are you talking about occasions when professionals are professionally obliged to get involved and to intervene? Yeah, well, that's a very tricky one. It's a very tricky one. I mean, the United Nations actually has a position to all countries that are signed up to it, which the UK is, saying we must phase out, get rid of all coercive treatment in mental health services. Obviously, it's different in prisons and so on. So I mean, I agree with that. I don't think coercion is ever justified, and I don't think it works, but that's not where we are. And in terms of the current, where we are now, what I always say is the framework is a very idealistic document. It'd be great if things were like this, but we have to start where people are, even if we can only make small changes, and none of us want to get sacked. Do you know what I mean? If we're working the system, we will almost certainly have to go along with some things we're unhappy with. But even within current rules, so I've worked quite a lot, I've done training with social workers who in the UK are the people who help to make the decision about taking someone into hospital against their will or taking drugs against their will. There are always possibilities of opening up slightly different stories and approaches. That may be the best you can do, but there's always some room for manoeuvre and change, I think. Okay. Any other comments or questions? I'm aware I'm talking for quite, shall I give you 3 minutes to talk to yourselves then, just have a break from listening to me, and then I'll see if anything comes out of that, and then we'll do the next bit. So 3 minutes to say, I agree with it, I don't agree with it. What do you think she meant by that? Yeah. Something's happened. Sorry. What I did was I took this out and put that in, but perhaps I shouldn't have done that. That was out and now it's in.
Yeah.
And it said the default speaker has now changed. Do you know what that means?
Okay, it's up again.
Okay, it's up again, so get rid of that.
Okay. What we were trying to do earlier is because the screen comes over here.
Yeah. I don't need the original one anymore. I don't need the extras one. I just need this main one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. We're back where we were.
Yeah.
Good. And the microphone's working, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been recorded and all that.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
All good.
Good.
I think.
Thank you. Right. That happened?
No. Was you know what's gonna happen?
current slide.
Okay. No.
Here.
Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can. We can make that come up on here, I think. Zoom.
I can still do it even if it's only on there. Just from current slide should work.
Yeah, no,
I see. So.
I think we need to have it like before.
Okay, anybody got any questions that they want to ask? Anybody got any questions or comments? Anyone got any questions or comments? Got a slight technical hitch here. Yes, yes. Yeah.
But the narrative doesn't fit the solutions for school now.
Yeah.
So that's the problem.
I think that often happens, yes. So the child's narrative is the most important narrative, isn't it? Whatever that is. So I guess there might be lots of ways of trying to make sure the child's narrative is central, and this is only one of them. But that would presumably be what all sorts of good practice would be, wouldn't it? About family therapy or whatever. It's about listening to the child. So I don't think this is the only kind of, it's a possible way of putting together a narrative, isn't it? But I guess the school has its own narrative about we can't do this and we can't do that. So it may involve some negotiation with the school as well. But those are very real difficulties. Those are very real difficulties. If the schools, I mean, it depends what understanding schools come along with, isn't it? Or whether they're working along medical lines, as they very often are, because that's what they've been told. So that will set up certain solutions and make certain stories more difficult to hear.
And school appointments, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
Why is that? What was happening?
Well, that's a very good question. If we call it a kind of condition people have, they've got school avoidance. It stops us thinking about, well, maybe they have good reasons for avoiding school, which may not be the school's fault, or maybe all sorts of reasons. But yeah, so that's an example of how we must, I call those psychological diagnoses in a way, school avoidance. They can shut down narratives just as much as medical diagnoses. Any other comments? Yeah. Preaching to converted, or the semi-converted. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Because I mean, because you're such a smaller population than the UK, I was kind of assuming it might be easier to change things, but I don't think. Well, that is a problem we have. Yeah, I'm going to show you some example of changes just before lunch. Yeah, and again, I don't think there's a single simple answer to that. But I mean, yeah, and you're not expecting one. I mean, sometimes there have been, I think, commissioners in the audience of talks I've given and so on. That's really important. And part of the answer is you have to what is the language that commissioners understand, or managers? Well, very often the language they really understand is this saves money. Sometimes, you know, the language that also works is this achieves recovery. So I think sometimes the answer is to set up projects at whatever level you can and then disseminate the results. That's not, you know, a single easy answer. But I mean, I will show you some examples of that. But I think change is not going to come from the top, despite those statements from the United Nations and the World Health Organization. I think change is going to come from the bottom, from people protesting about stuff that isn't helping them, from lots and lots of quite small-scale projects doing things differently, and from networking. So one of the things that makes us a relatively powerful group in the UK is we have very, very good networking. That's what this festival is about. It's a massive networking event. We do different things. We work together. We support each other. We've collected groups of journalists who are sympathetic. Some of us has contacts with our members of parliament. Some of us have contacts with our local managers and commissioners. You know, it's not a strategy you can exactly write down, but it's, you know, the more we can join together in different ways of thinking, the more powerful we are. That's my best answer, I'm afraid. Thank you. So I'm going to whiz on. Now it's very warm now, isn't it? Is that all right? Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of other aspects of the framework, then I'm going to show you some examples. So we've talked a bit about this already. We've talked about how we have our personal narratives, but how our narratives come from somewhere. We don't all on our own decide that we're failures or that we have certain kind of problems or whatever. So the framework has tried to do something rather ambitious, which is not just to suggest ways in which we can put together personal or family or social group narratives, but to think about narratives at a bigger level. Where does this come from narrative? Where does the bigger narrative about how women are responsible for being victims of sexual violence come from? Where does the bigger narrative about people living in poverty are there because they don't work hard enough come from? Those are some UK narratives. And so this is our replacement, if you like, for the kind of groupings that diagnosis offers. So diagnosis says that it's grouping people together because all these people have depression and all these people have this. We're trying to think of a different way of roughly grouping not people, but types of experience. So we're not coming up with a new way of putting people under labels. We're coming up with what we hope is a helpful way of grouping types of experience together in a way that kind of makes sense. So what we've done is to very tentatively put together some patterns which are meta-narratives, they're bigger narratives. So I'm going to show you what one of them looks like. So we're putting together some patterns about surviving bullying as a child or a young person. So everyone who's been bullied at school, let's say, will have a slightly different experience, but there will also be common elements to it. Surviving poverty, everyone who lives in poverty will have a slightly different experience, but there will be some common elements to it. So what people sometimes say about diagnosis is it helps me to realise, A, that it's not my fault, B, that I'm not alone. And actually, those are important benefits. I wouldn't want to take those benefits away from people, but we think patterns are a better way and a more evidence way of showing it's not your fault, it's so common, there's a pattern that describes it, and it's definitely not you, because look at this pattern, which describes many, many people in your situation. And it's another way of helping people to put together the links between my personal distress and the situation I'm in. So this is a pattern we've called surviving poverty. So every pattern starts with a summary, and then we look at power, threat, meaning, and threat response aspects of it. So you don't need to read all that, but this is based on a lot of research about the impact of living in poverty. So if we think back to the man who said he felt so bad because he'd lost his job and couldn't support his children, or we think back to the people in COVID who lost their jobs, then it might be of some help for them to realise this isn't just me. You know, everybody in this situation would be likely to feel like this. We've had some interest from public health officials in the UK as well, because if you're, for example, wanting to have a public health strategy about reducing people's misuse of alcohol, you have a pattern like this to guide you, which shows clearly that people are more likely to misuse alcohol if they're living in poverty, and these are the reasons why, you'd end up with a very different strategy than a kind of individualized strategy, which is about telling people about the harms of alcohol. Do you see what I mean? I mean, everybody knows about the harms of alcohol. Clearly their need to drink is stronger than their awareness of the harms. So we actually need to look at the function, the purpose of people's need to, whatever it is, in this example, drink. And a lot of it's linked, of course, to poverty. So those are the patterns, and we are continuing to develop them in the little yellow book that I showed you. We have some examples in there of how people found it helpful to read those patterns and realize it's not just me. Okay, I'm going to now briefly talk about the PTMF and what we might call culture. One of the worst aspects of the diagnostic manuals is that not only do they not work very well in the largely white Western culture in which they were produced, they're being exported across the globe. There's a movement called the Global Mental Health Movement, which I regret to say started in the UK, like many bad things, I'm afraid. But this is not about sending missionaries, but it's about doing something a little bit similar, possibly sending drug company reps to convert the natives. Now, I'm kind of making a joke about it, but actually what we're doing is not spreading Western science to countries that are unfortunate enough not to have it. We are spreading an ideologically driven narrative heavily supported by drug companies, which is really, really, really unlikely to meet the needs of people living in countries where there's widespread poverty, let's say, or any kind of problem. So the framework would take a very different perspective on this. The framework would say there can be no such thing as a way of, you know, putting together understandings of distress that applies across cultures and across countries, because we all, if our distress is always shaped by meaning, inevitably distress, how we understand it, how we express it, how we heal it, will look very different in every culture. And it'll look different historically if we look back over time. So we need to be properly respectful of the ways in which different countries and cultures within the UK, beyond the UK, have their ways of understanding distress, which often actually work very well in those contexts. So one of the ways of thinking about that is that the framework goes beyond what is usually included in trauma-informed practice to think about histories of colonization, slavery, intergenerational trauma, resulting discrimination, loss of identity, culture, heritage and land, and so on. It challenges some of the worldviews we have about how individuals are separate from the social group, about how we have a right to exploit the natural world because we don't feel connected to it, about how indigenous psychologies have many things to offer to us, about how many cultures, as I said right at the beginning, have their own practices, sagas in Icelandic terms, maybe legends which make sense in those countries and cultures and which are very healing. Healing in countries and cultures which has not come under Western influence typically takes place at the level of a group, not a person in a clinic sitting in a room. So I'm going to show you an example of this. In 2019, I was lucky enough to go to New Zealand and Australia, and I was invited to do a little tour of New Zealand and Australia. I think I did 7 all-day workshops, which was quite exhausting, but a very interesting experience. And my first stop was Auckland in New Zealand, where I asked if we could have a 2-day workshop in which on the first day I would present the framework, and on the second day we would hear from some Maori people and elders who were there for the 2 days, and they would talk about their ways of understanding distress. And we do a compare and contrast, and I didn't know what was going to come out of this, but it was the most fascinating experience of my professional career, I think. So the first day I presented all my PowerPoints, and everybody listened politely. And the second day, there were some Maori psychiatrists, 2 psychiatrists, but also some Maori elders who presented their understanding of distress, which of course is very, 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 very different. So we started off in a marae, a Maori meeting place, Maori being the indigenous people of New Zealand, of course. We acknowledged the influence of our ancestors, we sang songs together, and we talked together. It wasn't like me giving a talk, it was like the whole room talking together about the particular legends that make sense in Maori culture, which is about the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and the gods and how they interact and their conflicts and their relationships. I mean, all sorts of things you can imagine, maybe a little bit like your Icelandic sagas. So it couldn't be more different. It couldn't be more different. And yet in some ways we could kind of see some very broad similarities. So both the PTMF and Maori understandings are narrative-based. They're very different types of narrative. They're both narrative-based approaches. And in some senses, the Maori legends are also talking about power, threat, meaning, and threat response, not using that language, but these are universal human experiences, aren't they? So they were sort of reappearing in the Maori description of their stories. So the work of the framework is not to say, right, well, we can offer you this, we won't offer you diagnosis, but what about this wonderful framework? The work of the framework is to say there will be similarities and differences, and we can learn from each other. Yeah, and we can fully respect and learn from your ways of understanding, and maybe we have something to offer you too. Maybe it works both ways. And an actual example of this is that I met a Maori psychiatrist while I was there, and we wrote a joint article. This is an extract from it. She has done something very innovative, which is to set up a clinic in New Zealand run along entirely Maori understandings. So you can go there and, you will go along probably with your whānau, which is your extended family. You will sit down together, you will share stories and legends. And in this kind of way, a narrative will develop, which may be helpful to the person or the people who are in distress. About as different from Western clinics as you can imagine. Not surprisingly, it's proved very helpful for Maori people. So little Maori boys were being told many of them had ADHD and were being started on Ritalin. And in one study, they were offered this Maori approach, and it made a lot more sense. And they didn't have to end up on Ritalin. So Diana, one of the things she said was, the PTMF has acted as a distant cousin with more commonalities than differences. So she doesn't teach the framework or use the framework in her clinic, but the existence of the clinic of the framework allowed her to argue that we have a right to have our own ways of understanding distress that make sense to us. That makes sense. Okay, so that's all I'm going to tell you about the framework. I'm going to give you a few examples now. Okay, this is some of the morals we've talked about already. It's about storytelling and meaning making, universal human skills. The restorative power of truth-telling. Recovery is a process of reclaiming our experience to take back authorship of our own stories. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of brief examples. One is an example from peer groups. I don't know if you have peer groups in New Zealand. I'm sure you do. In the UK, we have Peer groups means a group of people who have been receiving psychiatric services and decided to set up a group on their own without professional help to support each other. And two groups that I'm aware of came across the framework and decided entirely without professional input to sit down together. Every week they would discuss one other question and about whether it made sense of their lives and whether that offered a different understanding. So, sorry, that's all the things the framework's done. So this is what one of the people who's facilitated one of these groups said. We found that sharing experiences utilizing the framework is an emotive and thought-provoking way to connect with others who've endured similar experiences. This may be the first time that the narrative and pain have truly been heard. It demonstrates we're not alone in our pain and suffering, whilst offering a new perspective on our distress. This takes us from being isolated and lonely individuals to being a wider community of equals. So Amanda has generously shared her story. I won't show you all of it because you can have the slides and it's on the website. But she, in thinking about power in her life, this is what she came up with. And as you can see, like many people who end up in services, she is someone who had many difficult events in her life. Sadly, in services, ended up being re-traumatized and told she had a personality disorder. That's not uncommon in the UK. So that's where she was when she started the process of putting together her story. I won't go through threats, meanings, and threat responses, because they're more or less, as you can imagine. She felt she had to self-harm, use alcohol, disconnect from people, be angry in order to protect herself. The framework is also about strengths, and diagnosis isn't usually about strengths. So she was able to recognize she has a lot of strengths. And she did have some help in services, which was useful to her. And this, sorry if I'm flicking through it rather quickly, but this is her final summary. This is what she put together as my story. So you can see that that's not denying any of the difficulties, and the difficulties haven't vanished. But it's a very different story from the one she started off with. The one she started off with was, I have a personality disorder and I'm probably never going to recover. And the one she's ended up with is, I'm a survivor of very difficult circumstances, but I have a lot to offer the world. And, you know, there's hope and meaning in my life. It's a very different story, isn't it? I'm pleased to say that Amanda has joined, we have a committee of people who offer training in the framework. She has joined us as one of our trainers, and she's a very good trainer. And we very much want to move forward with service users, with survivors. This is not just a professional kind of enterprise. Okay, so that's one example. This is another example. So that's an example outside services, and there are a couple of other examples which I won't show you today, which are also quite important. Some charities have been able to take on the framework, and because charities are relatively independent and more able to do what they want, there's an Irish charity called Jigsaw that works with young people, has taken on the framework in quite a big way, and in conjunction with their young people, they have rewritten the core questions, turn them into nice handouts with illustrations, which is very much what we hope people would do. And they use that to build stories with young people rather than just telling them they have a diagnosis. And they also use it to structure their referral information and to think about the language they use and so on. It's all on the website if you want to have a look. I'm now going to show you the biggest example within services. So this is a project that's been running for about 6 years in CNWL Trust in Northwest London. This is a trust that covers a third of London. It's probably about 4 million people. It's probably about 8 times the population of Iceland. So it's a very big trust. And on 2 wards in 2017, there was a particularly bad state. These are on 2 adult inpatient wards. If being on an adult inpatient ward in a hospital in London is one of the worst places to be if you ever want to recover. So this was very rigid, diagnostically based model with staff had low morale, very little psychology going on, high rate of violent incidents. So the staff very much wanted to do something differently. And so I've been working with this group for about 5 or 6 years now, but I mean, they've done all the hard work really. It's a multidisciplinary group that really wanted to change things, starting with the 2 wards in a particular hospital in Northwest London. So essentially there are 2 things. It's a 2-pronged approach, sort of. So first of all, they had a stabilization manual. So this is a trauma-informed approach backed up by the power, threat, meaning framework, because those 2 things go quite well together. So when people come onto an inpatient ward in London, they don't have a lot of time. They're allowed to stay for a maximum of 30 days or something like that. There isn't time to do the kind of therapy work, and most people aren't in a state to do that. What they do need is to be, you know, to recover enough to kind of take up their lives again. So they've developed these stabilization manuals. There's 10 manuals. I'm going to show you the link in a minute. They're free to use. They're in English, of course, but they're very generously making them available to anyone. So all the staff on the wards are trained to understand trauma-informed practice and to be able to talk through these manuals with everyone who comes on the ward. Now, not all these ideas will be helpful to everyone, but this is about establishing safety, getting better control over my mood swings or my self-harm or my voices or whatever, getting my eating and sleep back on track. This is valuable first stage work for just about anyone who ends up in a psychiatric ward, no matter what the diagnosis. So this is the basis of the work that goes on with all the staff and with all the inpatients. And to back that up, that's the links. Yes, an article has just been published. This is official evidence. It's found its way into the peer-reviewed literature, so it counts as evidence. You can cite it. You can say this works in London, maybe it will work here. Okay, to back it up, what they do is they have a staff meeting every week when they think about all the patients from the point of view of the power, threat, meaning framework. So on the right, it describes how the meeting goes. They have the person's background. They talk about staff feelings. They talk about any questions they're stuck with. Then they think about power, threat, meaning and threat response in that person's life. And that gives them the basis for thinking about a way forward. So the little boxes show that that's the reminder of the different aspects of the questions that they think about. So this is a facilitated meeting. It's a semi-structured meeting. And the idea is you come up with an understanding of that person, which gives you a better idea of their problem and a better idea of the ways forward. And it's not a diagnostically based one. So everybody throws out ideas. The facilitator pulls them together. We're going to have a go at this, by the way. And you end up with a piece of flip chart paper like that, powers, threats, meanings and threat responses, and that gets written up and shared with the service user in whatever form is appropriate, and that forms the basis of their plan. Now, this is a version of this is quite common in UK services. I told you about formulation a while ago, didn't I? A one-to-one narrative. In the UK services, this is called team formulation. Most services have some version of team formulation going on. Sometimes it's a bit medical, I think. This is a particular way of doing team formulation, which I've done for years before the framework came out. The framework gives a particular structure to a common UK practice, which I think works quite well. But so again, this is building on existing UK practice. So what are the results for staff? saying lots of stuff about how the frameworks help them to understand our patients better. There's always a story behind the presentation, and maybe when they seem aggressive or frightening, it's because they themselves are feeling frightened. So much more compassionate understanding of the service users. There's lots more to it, but I'll just show you a bit of it. The service users saying, I found these skills very helpful, very calming. I know how to calm myself down. I know how to be more compassionate to myself. You know, this is only the first stage of the journey, of course, for many service users, but it's an important one. So what are the results after 4 years? After 4 years, the changes are 90% reduction in self-harm incidents on the ward. If we had a drug that achieved that, every patient would be on it tomorrow, wouldn't they? Restrictive interventions, i.e. secluding people or holding them down or injecting them against their will. Significant reduction in the use of restraint and seclusion. Staff went from the least satisfied to the most satisfied staff across the trust. Increased understanding, compassion and skills, and the service users, 100% of the inpatients interviewed said their approach had been helpful. I think it makes a real difference on the ward. For the first time in a very long time, it's given me purpose and hope. So I really don't think peer-reviewed official evidence is the only important form of evidence, as I said, but partly in relation to the question earlier about how do we bring about change. Once it's in a peer-reviewed journal, it's actually been recommended by NHS England, the National Health Service in England, as a way forward for inpatient wards. Then it counts as evidence. Then if you want to do something similar, you can say, well, look, this is a really innovative project in London. So don't need to read all that, but in essence, they started off with this project on 2 wards. It's being extended across the trust. They have 14 inpatient wards, each with about 22 beds, big trust, lots of people. And it's been extended across all 14 inpatient wards. It's been extended to their perinatal service, their home treatment team, their community teams. I don't know why we need all these millions of teams, and it all's doing something slightly different and overlapping with each other. But anyway, the project continues. There will be another article about it. So I think if you went onto any of these wards, you wouldn't think a complete miracle had happened. You'd see a fairly standard ward with a lot of people sitting around, and there's plenty of labels and, you know, doctors doing doctorish things. But alongside that is a very powerful alternative that even in that restrictive environment seems to be helping. This is let me show you my final slide. So this is some of what we've been doing. And in fact, I seem to be missing yet another slide. There are 6 you won't recognize all those events. They're all quite high profile events. We've been invited across the UK. There are 6 translations in progress or happened. So there's Spanish, Danish, Norwegian. Norwegian's out, Spanish is out, Danish is on its way. There's an Italian and a Japanese version of the Little Yellow Book. There's others on the way. So it's created much more interest than we ever thought it possibly could when we launched it in 2018, feeling exhausted and thinking, is anyone ever going to read this damn thing? And they have. So, and I think that shows there's actually almost a worldwide desire for change. You know, the feeling that we're not getting it right, the feeling that we're not helping people in the way we want to, the feeling that somewhere we're missing something is, I think, very widespread. The framework is by no means the only way of doing it. One of its messages, well, a very core message is not stop what you're doing and do this instead. I'm absolutely sure you're doing a lot of things that are very much in line with the framework already. So part of the message is this is extra support for what you're doing already, because almost certainly the non-diagnostic stuff doesn't get enough recognised. And it also suggests some additional ways forward that may be helpful for you. So what you do, plus extra thoughts if you're interested in, and new ideas and opportunities to think and discuss. So we've got 10 minutes before we have a much needed break. Anybody? Should we stop the recording so people's questions don't get recorded? We can do that without something fatal happening to this. Thank you for listening. It's been a long, quite intense morning, so I do appreciate that. It looks like you're all still awake. Like I said, you'll be trying it out after lunch, hearing much less from me. But any questions or comments or